Good morning. If, in 100 years' time, strange thought, historians look back and remember what we were up to in November 2021, it won't be Owen Paterson they talk about. It won't, God willing, be Russian troops on the borders of Ukraine. It won't be the famous fish war against the French or Article 16. The one thing they may still be talking about then is the climate conference in Glasgow. Did this turn out to be the moment the world paused, thought twice, and began to turn aside the threat of a heating planet? Or the month when the world's leaders flinched and snoozed and botched it, bringing a host of new dangers? Right now, as COP26 ends, we are frankly far too close to it to know what those still unborn historians will say. But it's what matters, and this morning, of course, that's one of the things we'll be talking about. I'll be discussing all of that with the man who's been chairing those talks, the COP26 president, Alok Sharma. The United Nations climate change chief, Patricia, Espinosa, will run her rule over the agreement. And is the parliamentary sleaze story starting to move public opinion? All parties have questions to answer, and I'll be joined by Labour's deputy leader, Angela Rayner. But this is, of course, Remembrance Sunday. And as Russian forces mass on the borders of the Ukraine, I'll be talking to the retiring head of the armed forces, General Sir Nick Carter. Further afield, we won't forget Afghanistan as we talk to the Pakistani campaigner, Malala Yousafzai, and the man who's helping to support a pioneering women's orchestra, the composer, Andrew Lloyd Webber. And we will finish with, reflecting on Remembrance Sunday, one of our greatest actors talking about one of our greatest poets, Ralph Fiennes, on T.S. Eliot, patriotism and the eternal questions.
Big questions about what it is, how are we human, how we can be better at being human. And love is a key theme in these poems. True, big, sort of the love that conquers everything.
On the papers this morning, Helen Lewis of The Atlantic and Natasha Clark from The Sun. All of that coming up. Busy morning, but first, the news from Catherine Downs.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning to you. World leaders have struck a landmark climate change deal aimed at reducing global warming after 2 weeks of intense negotiations. The Glasgow Climate Pact is the most significant of its kind since 2015, but the pledges don't go far enough to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Queen will attend the National Service of Remembrance at the Cenotaph today in her first public engagement in more than 3 weeks. She had been advised to rest by doctors last month for health reasons. She'll be joined by other members of the royal family and the Prime Minister to lay a wreath at the War Memorial later this morning. The international best-selling author Wilbur Smith has died at his home in Cape Town at the age of 88. In a career spanning more than 60 years, he sold 140 million copies of his 49 novels, which include When the Lion Feeds and The Triumph of the Sun. And in rugby union, England thrash Australia in the autumn internationals, and there's a sensational win for Ireland as they beat the world's top-ranked side, New Zealand, in Dublin. And that's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. But for now, back to you, Andrew.
And so to the papers. And for once, let's start on a couple of Scottish papers which show us just how different the verdicts on COP26 are. Scotland on Sunday, make no mistake, we are still on the road to hell, it says. Well, the Mail on Sunday says Glasgow wins climate deal for the world. And then in the London-based papers, with lots and lots of stories, different stories in every paper. But the Sunday Telegraph has Sharma sorry for the COP26 coal climb down. And then we've got the Sunday Times. They've gone on a story, as I said, lots of sleaze stories this morning. A very, very interesting story about Grant Shapps, keen pilot, allegedly lobbying against his own government. The Observer, pursuing sleaze, has got some letters allegedly, or diary entries rather, I should say, from Boris Johnson's lover some years back when he was in the mayor's office. How Johnson pledged help for my business to win my love. Number 10 say that the Prime Minister obeyed all the rules at the time. And then finally, another Conservative MP, 300k linked to China's spy firm, says the Sunday Mirror. Much to talk about there. Welcome to you both. So let's start with the COP story. Helen, very, very hard to work out at this stage whether this is a success or a terrible failure.
Yes, and I think Alok Sharma got quite emotional last night, saying, he was sorry about this coal climb down. So essentially we're going to say, let's phase out coal power stations. That's now been changed to phasing down. But I think the really important thing about that is what's happened is a principle has been established, and that does actually seem quite optimistic. And the reaction this morning from the Green groups, by and large, has been quite nuanced. Jennifer Morgan of Greenpeace said, it's meek, it's weak, and the 1.5 C goal, so that's keeping warming above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, is only just alive, but a signal has been sent that the era of coal is ending. And so there is some cause for optimism this morning. Very,
very interesting. Natasha, your paper has it all over page 2 this morning, not page 1, but a lot on page 2. How much do you think Sun readers are focusing on this?
I think personally they're probably a little bit cynical about the whole COP process. Obviously, the optics, lots of leaders jetting in from around the world on their private flights doesn't exactly scream great climate change. But I do think they're interested. I think they're interested in exactly how this deal and how climate change is going to affect them. I think that's not really what's been talked about quite so much at the summit, is exactly what this means for real people and for real readers later on coming down the line.
Are they starting to get a little uneasy about the cost of replacing their gas boilers and so on?
Absolutely, and the cost of an electric car as well, which, as we know, is far above the cost of a petrol and diesel car. But yeah, the government are sort of banking on technology, they're banking on businesses, they're banking on all of these things, the price coming down, so it won't hit people in the wallet. But yes, I think that's definitely something that readers will be thinking about when they're looking at this deal.
Helen, Boris Johnson, in a classic sort of Borisism in terms of squeezing down everything into a key headline, said it was about cash, coal, cars and trees. And when it comes to deforestation and the coal deal, he's got quite a lot of what he wanted, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think it's not bad to actually try and think of some concrete nouns, because one of the big problems about talking about climate change has been, look at this enormous, terrible thing that's happening. What the hell can someone, just me, do about it? So phasing out coal is a big part of it. Cars moving, we already know that we're trying to phase out petrol cars, moving to more hybrids. Deforestation is a huge, the idea that trees are the lungs of the planet, and if we can somehow stabilise that. The one that's perhaps the most contentious is the idea of a fund for developing countries in order to help them combat climate change. Their argument is to the developed world, you got rich by burning, fossil fuels. Now help us out if you want us not to do the same.
Yes, I suppose the argument against that is that the Western world burned coal at a time when nobody knew what the effects of burning coal were. We now know, and therefore the situation is entirely different.
Well, you're being very generous. I'd like to think that we would nobly have refrained from burning coal had it been known that it was bad. But you were saying that China is an interesting player in that.
Yeah, China's been really interesting, and that's definitely been one to watch throughout the whole COP summit, is exactly how China's engaged. Obviously, we didn't have President Xi come to the summit at all, but his ambassador has played a pretty key part in these, and you saw John Kerry talking to him yesterday at the summit at the very last moment as they were haggling over the very fine details of this wording, specifically on coal, changing it, as you said, from phase out to phase down.
There was a great old Chinese Communist Party moment we read when the Chinese said, no, phasing out coal isn't in our 5-year plan, so we can't do that.
It's interesting as well, and I think COP is also something fascinating in terms of the short term to the long term. We know politicians only think about the short term and they think about their next election. These are promises that they're going to have to deliver on in 10, 15, 20 years' time if we're going to get to net zero.
Now, there was that extraordinary moment earlier in COP when Boris Johnson had to stand up in front of the world and say, no, Britain is not a corrupt country. And the last few weeks we've been going all these sleaze stories, one after another, and there's more in the papers today. I think probably the most interesting attack on any government figure is that on Shapps, the Transport Secretary, in the Sunday Times. And maybe we can talk about that and also about the front page and the inside of the Observer. Natasha.
Yeah, really interesting story from the Sunday Times on Shapps. As sort of the papers try their best to sort of dig up what might be considered slightly less than perfect associations with business. This is a story about Shapps, the Transport Secretary, who is a keen lover of flying, according to the Sunday Times.
He's a pilot himself. He's endlessly flying, apparently. Yeah.
Yes, and this is all about the money that has allegedly been spent lobbying on behalf of
small private airfields, isn't it? I can't remember what they call it, general aviation, but small private airfields.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely some questions for Shapps. However, I just feel obviously in terms of the whole sleaze angle, newspapers have been sort of digging for lines on this all week, and it does feel like the story is probably running out a little bit out of steam.
this is how the press works, isn't it? There is one big story, and then every paper competes to get the next story like it. And so every MP has been under scrutiny for everything they do as second jobs or third jobs and so on. And you think it's now finally running out of road?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we talked about the front page of the Sunday Mirror. I'm not quite sure how many people have heard of Richard Fuller and exactly what his links are. But yes, it doesn't feel like there's going to be anything resignation watch worthy in the next few days.
So, of course, what the opposition desperately wants is to turn this back to Boris Johnson all the time. And the Observer does have something real here. It's new diary entries from Jennifer Arcuri, who was Boris Johnson's lover back when he was mayor. It doesn't tell us an awful lot. It's got some quite interesting and enjoyable, salacious detail, I suppose, but there's nothing really substantial, or is there?
I think people have recently eaten this morning, so I'm not going to read out the Boris Johnson pickup technique for you. But what is interesting is about the relationship, about whether or not Jennifer Arcuri was taken on trips with him, whether or not she was given favours, and whether or not that was related to their personal relationship. And it is one of those things where the process takes a long time to go through.
Yes.
But things like this, as you say, what happens in politics reporting is a narrative is created. And I remember this very strongly from the MP's expenses story. This had all been signed off. MPs were essentially told, take as much expense as you want, we're never going to put your salaries up. It was all signed off and supposedly above board. And then suddenly when everyone went, well, let's take a really good look at MPs' expenses, people went, oh, this is pretty grim.
It's the same sort of process. We should say Boris Johnson, according to Number 10, followed all the legal requirements, they say. But that anyone who wants to know more can certainly read The Observer and have a snarf at that. Let's talk a little bit about the other big international story, because, well, people are saying climate change is a huge threat, but the other huge threat is what's going on the eastern borders of Europe, if I can put it that way.
Yes, so what's happening is Belarus is essentially provoking a conflict with Poland in particular and the other states in that region, backed by Putin's Russia. So Lukashenko, the dictator there, has been a rogue actor for decades now, and there does seem to be a mechanism where direct flights are coming into Belarus from Turkey, which we know is a big centre for Syrian migrants, also from Iraq, and somehow getting bussed to the border and left there in freezing conditions. It's a humanitarian crisis, and encouraged to make repeated raids across the border.
And they're being given tear gas, and the barbed wire is being cut by the Belarusian forces, we read. So this is the kind of thing that just one little extra mistake could provoke a war.
I think so, and particularly if you think about Poland's government, it has a very authoritarian government, and for them this is being represented as an invasion, particularly as a Muslim invasion. It is something that is an acute political challenge in that respect. So it is really worrying. What's interesting is that the suggestion that Putin may be thinking, actually Lukashenko may be a bit more of a loose cannon than even I would want. He was threatening to cut off Russian gas supplies, which led Putin to say he's just being very emotional. So, when you're a bit too crazy for Vladimir Putin, that's a pretty big flex, I think, yes.
Absolutely. Natasha, we haven't got much time left, but of all the people in the world we're expected to feel sorry for, Ghislaine Maxwell is probably low on the list. But the Mail has a really interesting interview got through a documentary filmmaker with her, in which she says she's been kept in pretty intolerable conditions in New York.
This is a really interesting interview with Ghislaine Maxwell, who's going to be going on trial in just a few weeks' time. She's talking about how rats have been popping up in her prison cell. She's been talking about the fact that she can't even get good food. I'm sure a lot of people won't have a lot of sympathy with her, but all eyes of the world are going to be watching when she finally does come to trial. But we were talking about this earlier, that it's just another symptom of the prison system, whether that we're talking about the US or the UK. Horrible situations that people do find themselves in, and she tells a very interesting story in that.
A read well worth reading if you've got time later on. Thanks both very much indeed for that. And so to the weather. Later on I'm going to be talking about T.S. Eliot. The old boy pointed out that midwinter spring is its own season, sempiternal. But is it really? Over to Matt Taylor in the weather studio. Matt.
Hello there, Andrew. Very good morning to all. It certainly doesn't even feel like autumn at the moment, does it? Because things are a little bit on the mild side. Although a bit cooler here in Shropshire behind me. Clear skies have led to some mist and fog forming along the Welsh borders. And that will gradually clear. But it's here some of the best of the sunshine, parts of northeastern Scotland as well. But the cloud is dominant for most. And it's bringing some light rain or drizzle across parts of East Anglia and South East. Although most of that will fade into the afternoon. A few splashes continuing. A bit damp and drizzly around these western coasts of England and Wales with plenty of cloud. But some of the wettest conditions later will be across the Highlands and Islands, a weather front pushing in. But with a strengthening breeze here and in Northern Ireland, actually see some of the mildest weather, 13 or 15 degrees. Now, as you go through this evening and overnight, that rain will actually start to spread across the rest of Scotland. Bit of a wet night for a time in Northern Ireland. England and Wales dry, but with some greater clear skies around. There's a greater chance of some mist and fog into tomorrow morning, and it will be a little bit cooler than the past few mornings. Cooler so across the northwest of Scotland, but at least here tomorrow you'll start the day with some sunshine, and that sunshine will spread across the rest of Scotland, Northern Ireland, after a bit of a damp start to the south and east. Turning a bit wetter across north of England, north and west Wales through the day, but much of England and Wales away from that should stay dry. The morning mist and fog clearing and a few sunny breaks coming through. Temperatures a bit down in today, but once again, Andrew, still fairly mild for this stage in November.
Fairly mild. Now from the weather, back to the climate. We're joined now from Glasgow, fresh from those talks, by the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Change, Patricia Espinosa. Patricia Espinosa, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to really ask you to give your verdict on these talks where we saw you again and again right at the centre, where the haggling was fiercest. There you were, taking notes, as it were. Can I ask you, first of all, whether this absolutely crucial goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is still alive?
It is definitely alive, Andrew. I think yesterday the conference got a very complete package of decisions that allows the world to say, yes, we are still on track for that. We are very far from that goal, but we did manage to get together this big package of different decisions that will allow us and gives us very specific direction on what we need to work on in order to get there.
All right. I mean, the reason I ask partly is that the Climate Action Tracker, widely regarded as very reputable, says that all the current pledges we're on at the moment give us 2.4 degrees of warming. What is the difference between 2.4 degrees of warming and 1.5 for people who aren't following this closely? What's the difference?
According to the science, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the difference between 1.5 and 2.4 is really survival of millions and millions of people and species in the planet. This is what is particularly true for the islands. When we heard at the Leaders Summit, the Prime Minister of Barbados, for example, saying for many here, 2 or 1.5 may be a number. For us, 2 degrees is a death sentence. So it really is a huge difference.
So I can remember sitting more or less where you are now, talking to a representative of the Marshall Islands. Does this deal save the Marshall Islands or condemn the Marshall Islands?
This deal still allows the Marshall Islands to be hopeful that we will accelerate the transformation that needs to take place. And that if we do that, particularly in this decade is absolutely crucial. We need to get to 2030 with a reduction of at least 45% emissions.
This was a really dramatic negotiation as well. Right at the last minute, when you thought you had a deal on coal, it suddenly unravelled from the Chinese and the Indians. Can you describe exactly what happened then?
Well, it is true, and I would like to underline that the huge step forward in our negotiation was the fact that for the first time in this context, we mentioned coal and fossil fuels. Before, it had not been possible. Of course, because there are so many different realities. We have to be very conscious that there are millions and millions of people also that depend on fossil fuel industry. And in terms of coal, there are many people, especially vulnerable and poor people, that also depend on that as a source of energy. So it's really a very difficult issue. On the one hand, we have clarity that that is a very big source of emissions, and we need to get rid of that. On the other hand, we need to also balance out the social consequences for so many people around the world, especially in the poor countries.
Yes, and in the end, the Indians said, we simply can't do this. And the language was very interestingly watered down in the final communiqué, and it's the difference between phasing out coal and phasing down coal. What does phasing down actually mean?
Well, you know, it's a bit one of those. In my view, it's one of those diplomatic solutions, textual solutions, which is intended to mean, okay, it's not yet. We're not yet saying that we need to get absolutely 100% rid of coal, but rather we need to reduce the amount of coal that we will be using. But in reality, and listening to the speeches of most of the countries that were present there, especially the islands, they were saying, look, for us, it's not phasing down, it's phasing out.
Thinking of a lot of people watching this, they may be asking themselves in Britain, why should we be making lots of sacrifices and paying more money while China and India are still burning so much coal? What would you say to them?
Well, I would say that we really need to look at the realities in the different countries. That's one point. But the other thing that I would say is, you know, in many ways in the developed industrialized world, where we are still using a lot of fossil fuels, those fossil fuels are affordable and make our lives more comfortable, but at a very high cost if we look at the amounts of money that are invested in subsidies. So if we could take those subsidies into the green economy, into creating the green jobs, into providing people with better sources of energy, that would be the difference. So I think here we need to look at the realities that that prevail in every society.
All right, Ms. Espinosa, thanks very much indeed for joining us from Glasgow. Thank you so much for that. Now then, how would Labour have approached these negotiations? A little earlier, I spoke to that party's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, and asked her whether the COP president, Alok Sharma, actually deserved praise for the agreement he'd reached.
Well, Minister Sharma did a tremendous job, and we all saw the emotion in his face when, unfortunately, things kind of unravelled slightly towards the end. But, you know, we have made some progress, and we have to acknowledge that. But we also have to acknowledge that we failed in getting that target of 1.5, and we must keep that pressure on, because it will be catastrophic for areas of the world and for our planet. So we've got more to do, but we have made some progress, and we saw Minister Sharma there doing his utmost. But Boris Johnson has undermined some of our efforts by, you know, the use of fossil fuels, the investment in that, the cutting of overseas aid. There's much more that we can do as a country to set an example globally to make sure we reach that target.
There was that crucial moment, as you alluded to, right at the end, when the Indians said, no, we can't do this. If you'd been in that room, what would you have said to them and the Chinese to get them over the line?
Well, to be honest, I've been a trade union negotiator all my life, and, you know, I think the important thing was Boris Johnson, I think, could have done more to be there and to make sure that in that room, at those vital opportunities, that we're able to sway the opinion. But it's also about what we do outside of the conference. And like I say, some of the actions of the Prime Minister and the announcements he's made have undermined the efforts of Minister Sharma. But he did do his best, and he has tried, but it's not enough yet. We have failed, unfortunately, to reach that target that we need to reach.
Do you think that the West should be paying reparations to poorer countries for the cost of climate change?
We have a responsibility to support the poorer countries as well, absolutely, and we've said that. And, you know, like I say, Boris Johnson cut overseas aid, whereas I think we should be investing in supporting. At the moment, we've got a Prime Minister who says, do as I say, not as I do. And I think that sends the wrong message out. I think we should be supporting households here and industries here with investment so that we can be world leaders on climate change and supporting the efforts that we need to make globally. But yes, we have to also support those countries who need that investment so that they can make the right choices as well. And if we undermine those efforts, then not only will we pay the price here, but some other countries will pay catastrophic prices for it. You know, the representative from the Maldives, you could see the emotion. The Prime Minister of the Prime Minister of Barbados, when she made her speech at the conference, you could see the emotion, because we know the catastrophic effects that this will have if we don't meet that target. So we have to renew those efforts. delegates.
Do as I say, not as I do. Could we have a commitment this morning that a future Labour Prime Minister will never use domestic flights and certainly won't use private planes domestically?
Well, Keir doesn't use domestic flights. You know, Keir always travels as green as we possibly can. And, you know, talking about domestic flights, we saw that those delegates that were going to Glasgow, unfortunately, you know, you've seen the train prices go up, ticket prices go up. It was actually significantly cheaper to go in a domestic flight than it was to use the train. So we need to invest in our public transport services. And this is the point I was making about what our government does. We have to push forward in using the most green and most efficient ways of getting around the country and being ethical in everything we do, not just here, but internationally as well. And that means supporting those countries to do the right thing.
Right. Another aspect of being ethical in everything we do is this current interest in so-called sleaze. Keir Starmer has been using his Commons office for Zoom calls with the public. Is that inside the rules, do you think?
Well, look, Andrew, we've seen throughout all the papers today, it's even more shocking than what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. This Prime Minister has allowed corruption and sleaze to enter our politics. 3.5 billion has been given in contracts to Tory donors and Tory friends. And, you know, at the cost of 9 million of donorship to the Conservative Party. Right. This has to be cleaned up. You know, the one thing that the British public do value...
I'm sorry, but let me ask you about Keir Starmer, which is what I'm asking about. Is it right that he has, and does he need to explain more about how he has earned £100,000 in legal fees since he became an MP?
Well, Keir Starmer has given up his certificate to practice, and we've been very clear, and I will not accept that somehow, if you look at those that are having lobbyists that have got contracts for consultancy, and now the revolving door between former prime ministers lobbying the government, the money that's been wasted, the taxpayers' money that has been wasted on dodgy contracts is absolutely obscene, and the sleaze and the scandal and the corruption has undermined our democracy. What I was about to say before is the British public value the fairness and playing by the rules. Boris Johnson does not play by the rules, has broke the rules on numerous occasions and allowed his ministers to. This has undermined our democracy, and he needs to clean up the act.
Do you think it was OK for Keir Starmer to stand on a manifesto in 2015 which promised to ban MPs from paid consultancies and then take £9,480 for advising the government of Gibraltar a few months later? Do you think that was all right?
Well, Andrew, we put a vote in Parliament in 2015 trying to ban the fact that these paid consultants.
Sure,
and, you know, we've got Tory ministers at the moment that are completely breaking the rules.
I'm just talking about personal behaviour.
Both me and Keir are very clear. Me and Keir have been absolutely crystal clear on this, and our manifesto has been consistently clear on this since 2015, that we would ban paid consultancy and directorships and, you know, lobbyists, because this is what's really undermining our country at the moment. Keir Starmer has not given taxpayers' money out to donors, to Conservative donors. This is what's happening at the moment. Billions of pounds that have been wasted on dodgy contracts, on PPE that can't be used.
You've said that. I'm just asking you again, why was it all right for Keir Starmer to take that money from the government of Gibraltar then?
Well, Keir Starmer has been very clear. Second jobs, we do not accept that. We don't accept paid consultancy. Keir Starmer, as the Prime Minister, will bring forward legislation to clean up the act, to make sure that ministers don't have a revolving door, former ministers, so that they can lobby the government. We will make sure that there is an independent commission for ethics and standards, and we will make sure that all ministers act in the best interests of the British public and not in the interests of their friends and donors, like we've seen throughout the papers today. Ministers who have been getting, you know, breaking the rules and getting away with it.
Can I ask you directly, would a future Labour government ban MPs from taking legal work?
The Labour Party is very clear that we want to ban second jobs, yes, and we want to clean up the acts. But I do not accept the premise But, Andrew, I do not accept the premise that what Geoffrey Cox was doing, advising a tax haven, which is described by the government as corrupt, and using his office to do that, in any way, shape or form, the same as Keir Starmer doing some legal work when he was first an MP. That is not the same. He's been using parliamentary... He was actually overseas. He wasn't even doing his votes for his constituents.
We all understand that. I'm just trying to ask.
It's got to stop.
Once you start to say we're going to stop this, you need to change the rules. And what I'm trying to find is what the new rules would be under Labour. Would you completely ban all outside work, or would you allow some work? Because there are some of your colleagues are doctors and nurses and so forth. They would presumably be allowed to carry on doing that. So what kind of work do you absolutely ban? What don't you ban?
Well, we said that we'd set up a commission for integrity and ethics to make sure that it's fit for purpose, so that we're always working in the interests of the British public. We said that we'd ban second jobs, but there will be some areas like where we've got an A&E doctor that's practicing at the moment, so that they can continue to do that because they need that for their professional practice. And actually it's good public service. But what we won't have is people, getting loans like we've seen from Jacobs Rees-Mogg, where he's got 6 million on a really small interest rates, where we've seen, Grant Shapps, who's basically been setting up his own lobbyist company within his own department to lobby his own government for his own personal means. Sleaze after sleaze, corruption after corruption. We've got to end this now because it really undermines public trust and confidence in our government. And it was John Major's government, the Conservative government, that brought in the Nolan principles, and this government is completely undermining them.
Let me ask you about something else which might undermine trust in politics, which is the words you famously used at the Labour conference. Let's remind ourselves, we cannot get any worse than a bunch of scum, homophobic, racist, misogynist, absolute pile of banana republic Etonian piece of scum. Now, you've apologised for that language. Can I ask whether you accept that that kind of language undermines faith in politics generally?
Well, I've absolutely apologised for using the word scum, and I think that was right to do so, especially with the discourse at the moment.
You see Boris Johnson every day. Have you apologised to him?
But, Andrew...
Sorry, you see him all the time.
I haven't seen Boris Johnson.
You're in the House of Commons with him.
I have asked, Andrew, this is really important. I have asked Boris Johnson to meet with me because I did lay some serious allegations because of his past comments. I have said about them being homophobic, racist and misogynist, and I have asked for him to meet with me to discuss that because I actually think all of us have responsibility around our language. I have apologised for using that language. I absolutely stand by that apology. But I do think that others, including the Prime Minister, should apologise for the language that he's used in the past, which has led to public discourse as well.
If he gets on the phone to you later today and agrees to that meeting, will you apologise at that meeting for the language you've used?
Absolutely, yes. If Boris Johnson wants to meet with me, which I've asked him to, I'm happy to do so. And I hope we can take it forward, actually, and he will apologise for his comments that he's made in the past. Because I think it's very dangerous when we allow people to say racist, homophobic and misogynistic comments and not apologise for them. When you're in a position of power and influence, then that does add to public discourse. I'm willing to accept my responsibility in that, and I hope the Prime Minister will as well.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall at that meeting. Angela Rayner, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this morning.
Thank you.
And it's Remembrance Sunday, of course, and amongst those gathering at the Cenotaph in his last year in the role will be the Chief of the Defence Staff, General Sir Nick Carter. I spoke to him a little earlier this morning before he went there, and I asked him what would be going through his mind during his final remembrance service as head of the armed forces.
Well, I guess what will be going through my mind in the privilege I've had to do the last 7 years as well. No, it's always something that gets at your heartstrings, particularly if you've commanded on operations in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, because not a day really goes by, and particularly on Remembrance Sunday, when you don't think about those people who've lost their lives or been wounded under your command. But of course, what's also important for me on Remembrance Sunday is it's a chance for us to remind people how horrific war is. And that's something I think which this country does so well. And that's why I think Remembrance Sunday really resonates in the hearts of all of us. And
particularly hard this year, probably for the families of Afghan veterans who've been lost.
Yes, and a lot of people are going to be wondering whether it was all worth it. And that's something that I think we should never lose sight of.
Well, we'll come on to that. Can I ask you about what's going on the border of Belarus in particular at the moment, where It seems that the Polish army are in a really, really dangerous situation, and the other side are pushing very, very hard. British troops are close by there. Are you worried that this is a situation that could quite quickly escalate into something really serious?
Yes, I think I am. I mean, I think this is a classic case of the sort of hybrid playbook where you link disinformation to destabilisation, and the idea of pushing migrants onto the European Union's borders is a classic example of that sort of thing.
And things are on the hair trigger, and there are British troops very close by, aren't there?
Yes, although what we're proposing to send there are engineers who will help build fences and support the Polish military accordingly. And of course what it shows is our unity with Poland and the fact we stand beside Poland against these sorts of threats.
On the border of Ukraine, Russian troops are massing at the moment, and some of your colleagues here and in the United States really believe that this could trigger full-scale war. Are you worried that the Russians could be about to do something silly?
I mean, I think if you look at the two things together, trouble up northwest, as it were, and then trouble around Ukraine, it's a classic example of a bit of distraction perhaps going on. And if you look at the Russian playbook over the years, the idea of maskirovka, as they call it, this sort of theatre that they apply to it, it's pretty typical. It's some stuff that's been going on for years and years and years.
So you don't think this is going to suddenly turn into a shooting war?
The answer is I don't know. I think we have to be on our guard. And I think we have to make sure that deterrence prevails. But critically, we have to make sure that there's unity in the NATO alliance and that we don't allow any gaps to occur in our collective position.
If, God forbid, this did turn into a war, is NATO ready to take on Russia?
I mean, if you look at NATO as a whole, the answer is it's the most powerful military alliance in the world. Whether or not it would go that far, I distinctly hope not. But we need to remind everybody that we're there to deter.
Is Russia now a greater threat than it was when you took over?
I think the security of the Euro-Atlantic area, as we talk about, is definitely worse than it was when I started as a chief 8 years ago. I think we as an alliance are much more capable than we once were. But of course, what that reflects, I think, is an escalation in terms of everybody's attitudes. And that's the bit I think that's slightly disturbing.
All right, so Nick, let's turn to Afghanistan. The last time you were on this programme, you told me that there's the possibility that the Taliban want to govern in a way that is less repressive. Since then, we've seen the Taliban parading trucks of hanged men through Herat, and we've seen 260 female judges having to go into hiding because they're so frightened of what will happen. Is it time to acknowledge that that possibility, you said, has gone away?
No, I don't think it is, actually, because I think that this is a different Taliban to the one that governed up until 2001. It's certainly not a Taliban that we would in any way wish to recognise at this stage, not least for the reasons that you describe. But they know that they've got a major economic problem. They know that they're governing a people, 60% of whom have been born since 2001, who have a different attitude to life. And the answer is that they will be different. What we have to do is to encourage them to be even more different than the Taliban that you're describing.
But it's the so-called moderate bit of the Taliban, the political commission, which has still banned all schoolgirls from going to school. Again, I put it to you that actually not much is changing and they are still the old Taliban.
I think there are a lot of things that have got to change. The fact of the matter is that the moderate lot, I think, are probably privately arguing to be a different sort of Taliban because they recognise that without inspiring their economy again, the country's going to collapse. And we've all seen these ghastly images coming out of your own reporting over the last 2 weeks of a potential humanitarian crisis.
But there's not much sign the Taliban have changed, is there really?
They are definitely different to what they were in 2001. And what we have to do alongside our international partners is to encourage them to become even more moderate than they are trying to be at the moment. But yes, I agree with you. The signs are not good. And that's why not many people are recognising them at the moment.
Meanwhile, as you've alluded to, there is a terrible, terrible famine beginning to unfold in Afghanistan. Is there any way that the West can help there without engaging with the Taliban?
Yes, there are routes that you can get money and aid to the Afghan people as a whole. Although I think it is sensible to try and engage with the Taliban as well, because they don't want a humanitarian disaster any more than we do. But I suspect how you channel the funds to the right place is the thing that we have to finesse.
Do you think we're going to have to recognise them to get what needs to be done into Afghanistan because of the humanitarian disaster?
No, I don't think so. I think it is possible to get aid to where it needs to get to. And indeed, I was talking to somebody who runs the Halo Trust the other day. They are able to cooperate directly on the ground. So I think there are ways of doing this.
Let me come a little bit closer to home and ask you, are women safe in the armed forces?
Yes, they are safe in the armed forces. I absolutely acknowledge that we've got some significant cultural difficulties that we have to overcome. And I think that part of our culture, often in trying to encourage the sort of camaraderie which prevails on battlefields, might not necessarily be the culture that's synonymous with trying to create inclusive teams. But we're working on this, and it's improved a lot over my 8 years as a Chief of Staff.
Well, the reason I asked the question is that figures from the MOD show that complaints about rape and sexual assault by women have risen tenfold since 2015. And I wonder why that's happening, whether that is really a success.
Well, in a way, I think it's a good thing if people can come forward and complain. Because, of course, it's very important, if you wish to heal yourself, that you create a culture in which people feel they are safe to complain. So that would be reassuring if that was the case. But quite obviously, we have a long way to go in terms of trying to make sure that people don't have to complain. And that, of course, is fundamentally about leadership.
The House of Commons Defence Committee said this: "It gravely concerns us that bullying, harassment and discrimination were experienced by nearly 62% of female service personnel and veterans who completed our survey. These behaviours include sexual assault and other criminal sexual offences." That's not success, is it?
No, it's not. It's not. But I think that survey also probably reported that 90% of the women that they interviewed for the report would recommend a career in the army to other women. So like all these things, I think there's two sides to the story. What I'm acknowledging as the leader of the armed forces is we have a way to go in order to stamp out that sort of behaviour.
When you said that the army actually promoted a laddish culture, what did you mean by that?
It goes back to the point I just made about camaraderie. And of course, what we're trying to achieve in the armed forces is that sort of spirit of teamwork, which works under very unpleasant set of circumstances, like we saw in Afghanistan during August. Now, the trick is to make sure that you promote a culture of teamwork and a culture that is tough and able to go close and personal with an enemy if you have to, whilst at the same time making sure that you promote a culture which respects teams. And at the end of the day, one of our values and standards is respect. And ultimately, people should be respecting each other to build the sorts of teams that are going to prevail on modern battlefields.
Well, let me ask you about a very specific thing. You must have read the awful, awful story about the young Kenyan woman allegedly killed by a British soldier. Her family is now planning to sue the Ministry of Defence on that subject. There's been a lot of comment about this. Is it now time for the Ministry of Defence to conduct an inquiry into this?
The answer is that the Ministry of Defence is cooperating very closely with the Kenyan authorities. And there are two questions to ask here. There's clearly the allegations associated with this murder. And then, on the other hand, there is some questions to ask, surely, about the fact that it's only taken until 2021 for this to come out. So I think there are some important questions to be asked in both respects.
And how did you feel when you read that story?
I was shocked.
Thank you very much indeed for coming in to talk to us.
Thank you, Andrew.
As an activist for female education in her native Pakistan, Malala Yousafzai was targeted by the Taliban and narrowly survived a gun attack. For almost a decade now, Malala has been living and campaigning in Britain. Last year, the Nobel Prize winner graduated from Oxford University and only last week announced the news of her marriage. Malala, welcome. One of the first people to congratulate her was a dear friend, the composer Andrew Lloyd Webber, who's a major supporter of Malala's work and who also joins me now along with Malala. Welcome to you both. So, Malala, I should start by congratulating you on your marriage. You were against marriage for a while. What's changed your mind?
I was not against marriage. I had concerns about marriage, and that is true for many girls around the world who have seen, reports about child marriage and reports about forced marriage and
the imbalance of power in marriage is what you're worried about.
Imbalance of power and how girls and women make more compromises than men, and how a lot of these customs are influenced by patriarchy and misogyny. So you have to question the systems that we are living in, and you have to question the status quo. But I'm lucky that I found a person who understands my values and a
very good cricketer as well, I gather.
Yes, he has passion for cricket, so that was another thing. And he understands my sense of humor, and we have a lot in common.
I know you're also a climate campaigner. What did you make of COP? What's your verdict on it?
So I participated in COP virtually, and I pushed for climate education for children and girls around the world. And we know that climate change is not an issue in isolation. It is connected to gender equality and girls' education as well. And Malala funded a report which shows that every year around 4 million girls are at risk of losing their education, and that's related to the climate events like floods and droughts. So, that was my expectation that the leaders would do something, but unfortunately, they have not met the expectations of me and other climate activists. And we, at this time, we must listen to climate activists like Greta and Vanessa, who are calling for more ambitious commitments from leaders. And I think leaders must prioritize people and the planet over profits in this moment.
Greta, Vanessa and Malala, that is a very formidable combination, I have to say. Andrew, you have been supporting Malala's work on female education, and you're using your new drama Cinderella, your new musical Cinderella. Can you explain why you are so committed to this cause and why Cinderella works?
Well, this Cinderella is a thoroughly modern young lady, and it's a rather fun rom-com taken on the Cinderella story, and not like you might expect. But I've been a huge admirer of what Malala has been doing, and we've known each other, for 3 or 4 years now. And it's been, it's a great honour for me to feel that at this time we can be doing something, particularly for women refugees.
Let's have a tiny little look at that unusual Cinderella, shall we? I see what you mean. It is rather different. Malala, let me talk to you about some other women, the women of Afghanistan, because you've been involved there very heavily. Now, earlier on, Nick Carter said that he thought the Taliban in Afghanistan were not now the same as they were back in 2001, but that there was some hope that they would be more moderate. What's your view of what's going on in Afghanistan now?
Firstly, the Taliban have been quite vague about their commitment to protecting women's rights. And they announced 2 months ago that Afghan boys can go to school. But for 2 months, Afghan girls have not been able to go to their secondary schools, and we have been running a petition, an open letter for that, and it's on awaz.org, and I ask everyone to sign that petition. We have already received signatures from more than 1 million people, and we are calling on the Taliban to immediately allow girls to have access to their complete education. We're calling on G20 leaders and other world leaders to ensure that girls' rights are protected in Afghanistan.
Do you think they're interested in what the rest of the world says? You come from relatively close to the Afghan border originally. Do you think Pakistan can put pressure on when it comes to women's education with Afghanistan's?
I think the neighboring countries have a big role to play, including Pakistan, and I hope that Imran Khan and other neighboring countries' leaders ensure that women's rights are protected. And it's not just for the safety of the people of Afghanistan, but for the safety of the whole region as well. And we know that Talibanization was not limited to Afghanistan. It spread across the border as well, and their ideology influenced Talibanization in Swat Valley that went from 2007 till 2009, and my story comes from that, where girls' education was banned, where women were flogged, they were not allowed to go to markets, and these were the things that were happening back in 1996 in Afghanistan as well. Women were not allowed to take any jobs, girls were prohibited from school. And at that time, the Taliban were spreading a similar message that girls' education ban is only a temporary ban. But we know that that ban lasted for 5 years. And I'm afraid that this ban that they have announced right now, that they are calling temporary, might not actually be temporary, and it may last for years. And girls should not be losing their right to education. And we know that Afghanistan right now is the only country in the world where girls do not have access to secondary education.
And of course, one of the other things that girls can't do in Afghanistan, or women can't do in Afghanistan, is play music, certainly in public. Andrew, you have been supporting an orchestra of Afghan female refugees who play music. Just tell us a bit about it.
Well, we've been able to get them out of the country now, which is really fantastic. I mean, one of the things that I think is well known is that music empowers young people. And that is why certain extremists don't want music to be part of their lives. And of course, it's such a huge part of my life that it seemed to be the very least one could do would be to help get these young girls out. And it's been fantastic that we've been able to.
Malala, you have said some very straightforward things about the Taliban. We don't know whether they want to engage with the rest of the world at all. But if they wanted to meet you, would you meet with them?
I think it's not about meeting them, or it's not about communicating with them. The message is very clear from me and from women and activists all around the world that they want human rights to be protected. All we are asking is for girls to be able to go to school, for women to be safe at their workplace, and for them to have their equal rights. And I think this is something that should be, it's nothing we're not asking for a privilege. These are like basic human rights that every woman and girl should have. And this is the time that world leaders can show their leadership. And I hope that, that these leaders realize that, we should not be living in a world where girls are denied their right to education, their right to school.
Well said, Malala. Andrew, thanks both very much indeed for joining us. Now, straight after this programme, BBC One will bring you the National Service of Remembrance from the Cenotaph. Sophie Rayworth is in Whitehall, where she has been talking to some of the veterans who are taking part. Sophie.
Last year, because of the pandemic, just 26 veterans were able to take part here on Remembrance Sunday. Today, it will be very different. They are back. More than 9,000 people will be here in Whitehall shortly. I'm joined by two of them, both who served with the Royal Marines, Ian John and Chris Kirk. You served with 40 Commando, 2 tours of Afghanistan, both of you. For you, Ian, it's your first time here. What does it mean to you to be here?
Oh, it means everything, to come here and pay our respects alongside people I served with, and people I haven't seen for a while. It means the world.
And it's going to be particularly special for you because you all served together. You haven't seen each other for a long time, have you? And yet you've come together today.
Yeah, we served together in 40 Commando, but also in recruit training together. So add a little bit more sort of poignancy, and as soon as you meet these guys again, it starts exactly where we left off, even though it's been 16 years since we've seen each other.
And added poignancy, given it is the 20th anniversary since the invasion of Afghanistan?
Yeah, definitely. Added poignancy. That's why we come here, to remember the guys that we lost, in conflict. And obviously for us being the younger generation, we feel it's something we need to, be here to pay those respects.
There is something very special about being here. You see, when the people are gathered here out in front of the Cenotaph, the camaraderie, which I believe you don't really feel, you can't get that anywhere else, can you? There's something very special about you all coming back together, even though you haven't seen each other for such a long time.
Yeah, it's been a long time, but like Chris said, we just pick up where we left off, really. Come down here to pay our respects, rather than doing it on our hometown. So yeah, a bit of a reunion as well, then to see the guys that we passed out training with, and yeah.
And who will you both be remembering at 11 o'clock today?
Well, anyone who didn't come home at the end of the day. It's all for them. We're just lucky that we did make it back.
Yeah, and exactly what Ian said. We're the lucky ones. It's the families who are left behind, and yeah, we'll definitely be remembering the guys who unfortunately can't be here today.
Chris Kirk, Ian John, thank you both.
Thank you.
And we've just heard that the Queen will not be attending the Cenotaph ceremony in person because she's sprained her back. I, meanwhile, am going back to the climate conference in Glasgow, and in a minute I'll be talking to the man who's been chairing those talks, the president of COP26, Alok Sharma. But before we do that, let's take a look at this clip from last night as Mr Sharma apologised to delegates and the world for the last-minute changes that were being made to the deal. Mr Sharma, you came very, very close to breaking down at that moment. Can you explain to us exactly what was going through your mind at that moment?
Well, Andrew, I think the first thing to say is that the Glasgow Climate Pact is a historic agreement. We have managed to do what we set out to do, which is to keep global temperature warming limits to 1.5 degrees within reach. And that was acknowledged on the floor by the climate vulnerable countries. It's been acknowledged by climate NGOs. In terms of what happened yesterday, we managed to get an enormous amount over the line. On a personal level, I have invested an enormous amount over the last 2 years in this. I've been out to see countries, to talk to people on the front line of climate change. Yeah. And of course, I'd had about 6 hours sleep in 72 hours previously. So it was an emotional moment.
But something had gone wrong, hadn't it, at the last moment when the Indians and the Chinese wanted you to water down the language on coal. Can you just tell me exactly what happened?
Well, what happened, and you saw this unfolding on the floor itself, which is that we had interventions from China and India in terms of changing the wording on coal from phase out to phase down. And at the end of the day, my job was to build consensus. That's what I did. There was obviously a form of word that was read out by the Indian delegate. And before that happened, I made sure that I talked to all the groups who were represented there, the parties, the most climate vulnerable countries, because my job was to build consensus. And the reason, Andrew, that even though this happened in this manner, and of course I apologise for the fact that it wasn't as transparent as the rest of this process has been, but at the end of the day, the reason we were able to get this over the line is because over 2 years, my team and I have built trust among countries around the world.
So did they just come to you and look you in the eye and say, sorry, we can't do this?
Well, I think over the past weeks, obviously there were certain countries that did not want to have coal language in this compact. But at the end of the day, this is the first time ever that we have got a language about coal in a COP decision. I think that is absolutely historic. But as I said, at the end of the day, China, India are going to have to explain themselves to the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. And you saw the reaction of the climate vulnerable countries to that change.
And your emotional reaction then was, in a sense, an admission of failure on that in particular. You wanted to get this over the line and you couldn't. Why not?
Well, Andrew, I wouldn't describe what we did yesterday as a failure. I mean, it is a historic achievement.
You apologised. You said yourself, I'm apologising for failure.
Well, Andrew, it's important to point out what we actually achieved yesterday. We kept 1.5 within reach. We closed off the Paris Agreement, which for 6 years had eluded the world. We did that under a UK presidency. We've ensured more money for climate vulnerable countries. And as I said, there was lots of other announcements as well in terms of the real economy. So by any stretch of the imagination, this is historic.
Sticking with coal, the world was going to phase out coal. Now we're going to phase down coal. Can you explain to people watching what phase down means?
Well, as I said, to phase out, you have to do that on the way to phase out, you need to do that on the way by of course, phasing down. But, Andrew, you know, just a year ago, if I'd been on your programme and I had said to you that by the time we got to this COP, we would have ensured that all the G7, all the G20 countries had committed to end international coal financing, you would have been really sceptical. We did that, right? We did that through this process. We did that under the G7 presidency that the UK led. I think it'd be really proud. I think we can absolutely say that we are on the way to consigning coal to history.
How big a personal embarrassment was it to you that the Prime Minister of Great Britain had to speak to nearly 200 of the world's other countries and start by assuring them that Britain is not a corrupt country?
Well, look, I think that was a direct question that the Prime Minister asked. What I would say to you is the reason we got this over the line, this particular deal, is because of the trust in the UK, the trust that we have built over the last 2 years because of our diplomatic efforts, and I'm really proud of that.
Do you think that trust is being undermined at the moment? And specifically, the Prime Minister has apologised for his handling of the recent problems to Cabinet. Do you think he should apologise to the country? And if not, why not?
Andrew, I spent the last 3 weeks hunkered down here in Glasgow. All I can tell you is that around the world there's an enormous amount of trust in the UK, and that's why, you know, even at the 11th hour, we were able to get this really historic deal over the line.
Now, you said, and you were choosing your words carefully, I'm sure, that the 1.5 degree of warming target was still within reach. But according to the Climate Action Tracker, which is much admired, they say that with all the target pledges, including those made in Glasgow, global greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 will still be around twice as high as necessary for that 1.5 degree limit. With the 2030 pledges alone, without longer-term targets, global temperature increase will be 2.4% in 2100. Now, how big a failure would that be, and what would that mean, 2.4%?
Well, Andrew, we have to look at where we've come from. So before the Paris Agreement 6 years ago, the world was on target to 6 degrees of global warming. After Paris, it was tracked down to under 4. And what you've also seen is that if we take all the commitments into account, we're heading to below 2 degrees. I think that is an achievement. But of course, I said yesterday, this is a fragile win, because at the end of the day, what we need is to ensure that all of these commitments are delivered upon. And for the very first time in these texts, what we have got is a commitment from every country to look again at their 2030 emission reduction target, come back next year for us to have annual ministerial meetings on this issue, and of course, for a report to be produced on how countries are doing. That is a first. That is historic.
You've got a hard year's work still ahead of you, Alok Sharma. Does that begin with going back to the Chinese and the Indians and pleading them to go further on coal?
Look, I am going to be calling on everyone to do more. But as I said, in relation to what happened yesterday, China and India will have to explain themselves and what they did to the most climate vulnerable countries in the world.
Let's look at what all of this means for the UK. Our plans are already quite far advanced. Does this deal mean that we now have to go further and faster?
Well, I think from the UK perspective, we are world leading when it comes to climate action. You talked about the climate action tracker. You can see on there the UK is way ahead when it comes to developed countries around the world. But of course, we've now set out our net zero strategy, and we're going to have to deliver on that.
The agreement commits to a dialogue on loss and damage suffered by poorer countries as a result of climate change and the possibility of reparations. Is the UK going to pay reparations to poorer countries?
Well, Andrew, again, this is a historic first. So when you talk about, is this a deal which is good for countries around the world, particularly the most climate vulnerable, the answer is yes, because for the first time we have got language on loss and damage in there. Of course, this is going to be a process in terms of how that particular issue is addressed. But I know one of the things that people really appreciate is the fact that we have got action committed to in this compact.
I'm sorry, I'm just asking very specifically whether Britain is going to pay reparations to other countries for historic climate change damage.
And what I'd say in response, Andrew, is that there is a process that's been set up and we will see where that goes. But the UK can be very proud of the fact that we also are giving, in fact, we've doubled the amount of climate finance commitment that we've got over the next few years from the UK, and that I know is appreciated around the world.
Is it conceivable that the UK could be paying reparations to China for what we were doing in 1870? And given where they are on coal now, a lot of people would find that frankly bizarre.
Well, Andrew, you're asking me to gaze into the future. What I'm saying to you is that what we've done for the very first time is set up a process for looking at this issue. I know that's really appreciated by developing countries, by the climate vulnerable countries. And of course, anyway, we need to be doing more to support the climate vulnerable countries. And I'm proud of what the UK has done.
There's an important part of this agreement about deforestation and the world's forests. But there was an important agreement on the same subject back in Paris, and that came to nothing. Why do you think this agreement can actually produce change on the ground?
I think there is a change in the way that everyone is approaching this issue. There is a new sense of urgency, and I think we've built on that here in Glasgow. Of course, we will track and see what countries do over the next few years. But Andrew, this is a process. This is the 26th COP. There will be another COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. We build one on top of the other. But make no mistake, this is a historic achievement that we have got here. It is something that has been built amongst almost 200 countries because of the trust that we have forged across the world.
Greta Thunberg, who we talked to a couple of weeks ago on this programme, has dismissed the conference as blah, blah, blah. Now, what could you say to her? What would you say to her if she was in front of you to persuade her that she's wrong?
What I would say to anyone is talk to the climate vulnerable countries, ask them whether this conference delivered for them. And you heard that on the floor yesterday. Countries do feel that this has been an incredibly meaningful COP. It is producing more finance. It is ensuring that countries are going to take care of emissions. And ultimately, we're also going to ensure that we're providing more support for developing nations. That's something that we should be really proud of. But of course, it's not just about commitments, it's actions. And that's what I want to see tracked.
Are there any teeth in this deal to enforce those actions?
Well, I think the fact that countries have signed up to this commitment, I think, is incredibly important, Andrew. And, you know, we will judge each other by the commitments that we've made. Just the fact that we've had almost 200 countries agreeing to this, I think, is vitally important. And countries know that they're going to have to deliver on their commitments.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about our country. There's an awful lot still to do in the UK to decarbonise. world leaders or not, that's much disputed, but there's a lot still to do. Do you think this country needs a specific government department to do that, a kind of decarbonisation or a green government department?
Well, we have a range of policies across a whole range of departments. We have committees, of course. There are 2 cabinet committees, one of which I chair, yes, when we bring government departments together. In fact, the process of producing the net zero strategy was something that was produced collectively through the committee structures that we have.
So you don't think a new government department is needed?
Andrew, those are matters for the Prime Minister. And ultimately, he has to decide what is the best way to organise these issues and what is the most efficient way to deliver on net zero in the UK and in terms of our commitments. But my job over the past year has been to bring 200 countries together, almost 200 countries, and deliver what I do believe is a historic deal.
Do you think it was appropriate for your former colleague, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, to set up a special unit inside his department to lobby for private airports, he being a keen user and pilot of those airports? Was that an appropriate thing for your colleague to do?
Well, as I said, Andrew, I've spent the last 3 weeks hunkered down here in Glasgow. What I would say to you is that Grant Shapps is doing a great job in transport. He has set out the transport decarbonisation strategy. He leads on the Jet Zero project that we've got. So there is an enormous amount of good work that is going on in the department, indeed across the whole of government when it comes to meeting our net zero targets.
But I'm sorry, I was wondering whether there was a but there, whether you did think it was appropriate for him to do that kind of thing.
Well, as I said, Andrew, I've really not looked into the details of any of this. I mean, I hope you'll forgive me that on this occasion, I literally have been hunkered down here for 3 weeks in Glasgow.
I do understand that. So when we last spoke, the Prime Minister just said that civilization could go backwards unless we got this right. Have you saved civilization?
Well, time will tell what this has achieved. What we have got are historic commitments. I said, that's really, really important. You need to have those commitments first. And just take one of the issues that we've been trying to get over the line. When we took on this presidency, less than 30% of the world economy was covered by a net zero target by the middle of the century. We're now at over 90%. That is really moving things forward. But, Andrew, as I said, the commitments have to turn into action, and it's only at that point that we see whether we're making a real difference.
Alok, Sharma, thanks very much indeed for joining us from Glasgow and getting some well-earned rest. Thank you so much. We are almost out of time, so thanks to all my guests this morning. In a few minutes, we'll be handing over live to the National Service of Remembrance. But before we do that, something very special to end on today. The Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot, arguably the great poetic achievement in English of the 20th century. Now, they've been dramatised and they're being performed by Ralph Fiennes in a new stage version. Written mostly during the Second World War, they're Eliot's heartfelt reflections on time and loss and, above all, on love. I talked to Ralph Fiennes on Remembrance Day in London.
So, here I am, in the middle way, having had 20 years largely wasted, the years of l'entre-deux-guerres, trying to learn to use words. And every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure. I love Eliot's inquiry in what it is to be human. He asks the big questions about who are we, where are we going, what is the point of it? Because one has only learnt to get the better of words for the thing one no longer has to say, or the way in which one is no longer disposed to say it. And so each venture is a new beginning. The big theme is time, how we're trapped in the idea of sequential time. So he's pursuing the idea of how can we be in the present moment, which contains everything. And that I found a very moving and challenging proposition.
Because they're clearly religious poems. He was a committed Christian, but they're also, they refer to Eastern mysticism, and in a strange way they kind of refer to the modern physics about time that hadn't been discovered when Eliot was writing them.
That is true. Well, I think he references Krishna and Hindu, Buddhist philosophy. And it's all about the idea of being present. Clinging to the past and future dynamic is our trap.
Yeah. Now, we're talking on Remembrance Week, And Eliot wrote these poems just after he had in fact served as an air raid warden during the London Blitz, and certainly parts of the poems are full of fire and smoke and dust.
Yes, this is in Little Gidding. He himself is the lost figure in a wind-blasted city landscape coming across the ghost of a dead master, who sort of reminds him of the vanity of all his endeavours. So these ideas then, he developed them, I would argue, in the Second World War, yes, when the nation was under threat.
There's intense patriotism here. He was an American who became a naturalised British citizen by choice and obviously served through the war, and the war is in these poems all the way through. So they are, in a sense, patriotic poems too.
Well, they're not flag-waving. They're just about identity. I mean, I have the whole thing of patriotism is sort of, I mean, it's just who we are. Our identity can be calmly acknowledged without having to sort of create more elbow room about who we are. I think this was a place under threat, and it was England, and that's where he lived. The sense of nation is there, but it's big, big questions about what it is, how are we human, how we can be better at being human. And love is a key theme in these poems. True, big, sort of, the love that conquers everything.
All manner of things will be well. Yeah. Let me just ask you a little bit more about patriotism, however, because a lot of people watching will be thinking, when they see your face, they'll be thinking of the new Bond film, and shortly they'll be seeing a new film that you're involved in, the Kingsman film.
You cannot keep me locked away as the world burns.
Son, the truth is the world is ruled by corruption and greed.
We must do something.
Certainly.
These are films in a completely different mood. Yeah. I mean, they're almost cartoonish. They're a different kind of spy film. And in the new one, you're throwing right back to the First World War.
That's right. I play the Duke of Oxford, who is a pacifist aristocrat. And his son, the son is keen to prove himself in the war that's approaching, the First World War, and the father doesn't want the son to go to war. So it's an unusual proposal that you have a very aggressive, no, that's the wrong word, I suppose, but a very emphatic pacifist father figure. Of course, things are turned around in the course of the story.
Rasputin, your reputation precedes you, but merciless.
Let's return on this special day to four quartets and Little Gidding, and ask you a little bit about your own involvement, your family's involvement in the war. I lost members of my family, or my family lost members during the war, and I think your grandfather was a brigadier, much decorated in the war. Do you think about him on this?
My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a brigadier. He fought alongside General Slim in the Burma campaign. He was in the Indian Army, the British Indian Army, yes, and also, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, lost her brother Peter in a submarine in the Second War. Yeah.
So you think about them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to ask you to read a passage for us from Four Quartets. Mm-hmm. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you're going to read before you read it?
Well, I thought it's towards the end of Little Gidding, where Eliot reflects on the nature of dying, or those who are dying come back to us, and we are born with the dead, and we die with the dying. So I think what I take from it is that the dead are always with us. Every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning. Every poem an epitaph. And any action is a step to the block, to the fire, down the sea's throat, or to an illegible stone. And that is where we start. We die with the dying. See, they depart, and we go with them. We are born with the dead. See, they return, and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. A people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments. So while the light fails on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now, and England